everyone, it's Cassia Strub with Music for Your Inbox, and today I'm going to be chatting with John Eagle and Fourqurean to talk about their music video that they made this month that uses this awesome instrument called the hydro-clarinet. I'll leave it to them to explain, so let me just invite Ford and John to join us, and we'll start talking. Hi, Ford. I think I see John coming on. Hi, John. So I'll just reintroduce you to, we've got John Eagle and Fourqurean, sorry, I'm saying your name wrong, Fourqurean, who have collaborated to make the video for this month. The piece is called Transient Flows, but the name of the instrument is the hydro-clarinet. So I guess I'll just kind of jump in with the actual piece, and then I can ask you guys a bit about yourselves as artists individually. But sort of the lowest hanging fruit, what is a hydro-clarinet and how is it put together?
Well, I can start with that one. The history of the instrument is one of those kinds of projects that just kind of started small and just kept on growing in unpredictable ways. It started off with a very simple, like Ford asked me for a solo piece for clarinet. Ford's a very good clarinetist and had asked me for a piece for clarinet, which I thought about for a few days and then kind of decided I didn't want to write for clarinet, so I came up with something else and was trying ideas just like connecting clarinet to like a tube and all these other things to kind of I guess put, you know, usually the solo instrument genre is like kind of a masterful player like playing with a lot of technical control and also just kind of gestural, you know, expressive control. And that was that's a paradigm I'm not really interested in. So I kind of, in some ways I wanted to invert that and put the soloist in more of a kind of reactive, responsive position. And so the creation of the instrument kind of unfolded over a year, and Ford is one of those people that is just like, you know, up for anything a lot of the time. And so it kind of evolved into this thing for this water cycle, which just means there's a single water pump pumping water from into this kind of instrument, and then which outputs back into the same place. So it's a complete cycle. And in the middle of all of that are all these ways that Ford can intervene and perform with things and kind of deal with things in certain ways. And there's a bunch of valves and kind of water mechanics that I still don't fully understand myself, but kind of can make them work. So yeah, that's the history. That's the instrument itself.
Yeah, it seems like, just to sort of like describe it to people, you know, it's a series of PVC like pipes, and then there's some transparent ones as well. Right. And then there's some valves. But I mean, I am certainly not the clarinetist that Ford is, but I do own a clarinet and I did play in high school band. And the only part that I can see that looks clarinet-y is the mouthpiece. Is that right, Ford?
Yeah, that's true. Basically, it strips away all of these other aspects of playing the clarinet, but essentially it's a tube with a vibrating reed against a mouthpiece facing. If you put a saxophone mouthpiece on it, if you put a bass clarinet mouthpiece on it, it would be different based off of the way the reed vibrates against the mouthpiece. So in a way, it's still a clarinet because you are essentially doing the same mechanics, and it's all about controlling the length of tube, which is essentially what a clarinet is, right? It's like how much tube and the register. So is it functionally different? A little bit. I found that the size of the reed, and this is something that John and I experimented with, really made a difference. When I put a bass clarinet mouthpiece on it, I was having a lot of trouble getting a lot of the sounds that we found really compelling, like a lot of the higher, like squeaky sounds, a lot of the ways that sort of interacted really well with the water. It just wasn't there with bass, and it required so much air that it didn't make sense with the project itself. That said, though, you could hypothetically try different types of mouthpiece combinations, but what makes it the clarinet is the fact that it still has the reed there, and you're still using partial structures on the reed to really sort of create your melodic lines and create your flowing gestures. And I think once like people see the video, they'll see, okay, it's not what I was expected, and the sounds that are being produced are not clarinet-like, but it's still the same mechanics, which I think are really fascinating.
Sorry.
No, add more in, John.
I was just going to say, Ford brings up an important point that it is, you know, it's a clarinet mouthpiece and a tube. What's different is that the air column that through the tube is constantly being modulated by the amount of water in the instrument, which is really the idea that kind of stayed in there from the beginning. You know, a lot of things that went through a bunch of different prototypes, but it was always this idea that the amount of water in the instrument would control the length of the air column, which is functionally what a clarinet is. But what's different is that it's completely unstable. So all the work that wind players do, learning how to, like, you know, memorize the feeling of a note with, you know, where they can anticipate the feeling based on how many fingerings they have down, what kind of embouchure they're using, all kind of goes out the window, because it's like, you know, playing with a clarinet that's constantly going from 3 feet to 5 feet, or, you know, everything in between is kind of the idea. And so I will kind of clarify something for it, said that, like, when you play it without the pump on, it does kind of sound like a clarinet. But what's different is that it's always kind of, you know, you never get a stable tone. So that makes it's always, you know, you can start it, and for a second it might feel like a C sharp or some note that every clarinetist knows backwards and forwards. But it's, you know, as soon as you start it, it's being changed. And so, you know, all these other things are happening with, like, Ford's embouchure, I think, as you're trying to stabilize a note based on your own kind of training as a clarinetist, but none of it works like you expect it to.
Yeah, because I've heard Ford's role in this collaboration described as performer, but then also kind of system manager or operations specialist. And I'm wondering, Ford, for you, like, if you could talk a bit about, like, is it a score that you're following? Are you trying to maintain a specific pitch, and then we're watching you manage that? Like, what is your, I guess, your task that you're tending to throughout the course of the piece?
So there are 4 individual sections that we've sort of come up with through the workshopping process. And you have this flow that you go through as the performer. And while I would say I could technically follow a score, like if you gave a score to another person and had them read the instructions, it's sort of like having someone put together like an IKEA desk. Not the instrument itself, but like the idea of, like, okay, you have this set part of instructions, and I could choose to follow them and I could choose to not. And eventually the like third part of the piece, which is sort of like the volume, sort of like climax of the piece, and sort of the structural high point of the piece, you know, that's sort of like the desk being built. And how you get to the desk being built, it's different each time. There's a lot of variability. Like John was saying, with the different types of pressures that you're dealing with, it's very hard to get the exact same sound each time. So it's not going to sound or ever be like fully notated in the same way that you would see like highly structured and notated, like fully notated scores. But there is a flow for this one particular piece. That said, though, there's a lot of room within that for it to be, you know, there can be as many transient flows as possible as performers out there, and it will sound completely different, but still retain the quality of the instrument.
John, we just have to convince another clarinetist to learn this.
John would have to drive the instrument down from Ithaca for another clarinetist to learn it. That's truly, it's not exactly TSA.
I can gather that. Somebody asked a very reasonable question in the chat a moment ago, saying, does somebody have a picture of this clarinet. I don't on my person. I will say in Music for Your Inbox Instagram feed, there are currently a few images, and there is a trailer that shows Ford's video work of the clarinet itself. Because yeah, I realize that this description we've given is not painting a totally clear picture in people's minds. And I remember how that felt, because when John first told me about this, which I think was last August, we were working together on something and he was describing what he's doing. And I was like, wait, like, stop what you're talking about. Open your computer, show me this thing. It sounds amazing. So it really does need to be kind of seen. And it sounds like, Ford, it wasn't set up in your house for you to practice, right? It was something that John had to install somewhere.
Well, John dropped it off, and it did sit there. There were a lot of, New York apartments are small, and so there were a lot of conversations surrounding that. It is actually like a pretty big instrument. It's maybe about 5 feet tall when you set it out, and it's on this one particular stand. If you happen to like flip over to the Music for Your Inbox page, you'll sort of see that it's on the singular stand. And so within the video itself, you'll sort of see like things like wobbling a little bit, or you'll see these like micro motions. It's because this thing is not ever fully really stable. And it's actually sort of kinetic in a strange way that I find really fascinating.
I noticed that, so Ford, we should mention in this chat, is also the video artist for this month, because you filmed it, you performed it, and you filmed it, and you edited it and made the movie, because I know that you have a lot of skills in the filmmaking world, especially surrounding music films. And I noticed when I was watching the video, I would think like, oh, is that the camera shaking? And then I realized like the entire apparatus that this clarinet is affixed to is kind of moving. Is that because of like the water pump, or is that because you yourself are moving it? Like, what is causing that?
So if I am adjusting a pump here, a lot of these are, so not a pump, if I'm adjusting a valve like on the left side of the instrument and I turn it, that valve has a lot of individual like pent up like potential energy that as soon as I hit it, it's just like it causes the rest of the instrument to move. They're pretty stuck valves. In the DPA microphones, there are two that are connected to the side of the instrument that you eventually move down to hear the water itself. So you have the option of hearing it at different points on the instrument itself. Depending on the placement of those DPAs, you can really hear the sounds of those valves turning. And so it like all of a sudden you'll hear like sort of like room noise, and then crack, water flows, because you're opening up the sound of the DPA to whatever flowing water. John, feel free to explain more about that process too. But I think it's really fascinating to see that, just to hear that immediate close miking of that cracking or like valve motion, see the instrument moving, because it shows sort of the like force involved in that movement too.
There's a lot of pressure within the instrument. I mean, there's the impact of the water flow itself coming in, and Ford can kind of regulate how much water, the speed that's coming in. And so that is always kind of changing the way the instrument is moving. But then when he gets more active on the clarinet mouthpiece playing into it, the way it's constructed is that it's kind of controlling where the air column is moving, and which creates a lot of internal pressure. And so when, like for instance, whenever he takes a breath when he's kind of in that mode, there's a bunch of pressure that gets released. And so, I think about the way skyscrapers are built to move. Like, I'm not an engineer. I have no idea at what points like it would break if you kind of made a more rigid structure.
Right.
But it does kind of need to move with his performance and with the water flow itself.
All right. Well, we had that makes actually a lot more sense, because I kind of feel like I understand a little more, because a lot of the camera angles are quite tight, so that we can see all this detail, but then sometimes it's hard to capture the macro view of the instrument in terms of scale of a person playing it. But someone in the chat was just asking for like, okay, so John drives from Ithaca with a suitcase to your apartment in New York City. I'm assuming he sets it up for you.
Well, he dropped it off, and we didn't do a whole lot with it for a year. We had a workshop, and then during the pandemic, it was dropped off at my place to like experiment with a little bit, and then we went back up to Ithaca to workshop more. And so it's been a multi-workshop process going back up to Cornell to really figure out, okay, what's the best way to capture it. We actually had an earlier version of the film about a year ago that we shared with you, and doing that first one, it was sort of like it was a real like try and fail experiment for us, because we got to see, okay, what shots are actually compelling here. How do you take sort of like a DIY space and light it to sort of capture what this instrument's about? There were a lot of small things that I really didn't like about that version, and that's partially why we are so tight in this. You start to see so many of the water motions going through that you don't see in the first iteration of this. And I think every revision, we're sort of getting closer and closer to what is like this weirdly like geographical natural flow of this. Like if the instrument's a map, it's fun tracing from beginning to end, from pump back to pump in this large loop that sort of is weirdly engrossing. It's crazy to think how you can get sucked in over 20 minutes into the weirdly captivating river of, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I noticed
flow.
that exact thing when I was watching the video. I was seeing, I'm like started to map like where it was going and the water and the sound. And the fact that you have microphones embedded within the instrument, as well as room mics, mean that you've really captured an audio perspective that I don't even know if that's what it sounded like in the room. I'm reasonably certain it didn't. So you're really, it's a pretty unique experience. If you were to hear this instrument live, you would have a totally different experience, and you certainly wouldn't be able to map the water like what Ford is describing. The parts that I found particularly captivating is watching you pull out. There seemed to be a series of tubes or is there just one that you can remove and then put in somewhere else, and mapping like where you're taking that out and putting it in. And again, it was neat to hear the audio shifts with that, as well as reinforcing that through the video. That is really carrying through. And it's funny because we talk a lot about like the sort of challenges of creating an engaging sound film for something that is kind of thought of as a concert instrument. But then I keep thinking about the fact that John's always writing this music that's really hard in real time. And I'm curious if you could talk about, John, if you see a common thread in your kind of work in general, not just with this piece, where you're asking the performer in real time to do hard tasks that are always hard, so that this virtuosity is never achieved. And I don't mean this in a negative sense. And what I'm referring to, just so people understand, is I once played a string quartet of yours where you were asking people to perform complex math equations in their head and shout out the answers as they were playing. And that was like, it never felt like, oh, I know this piece, because it wasn't reciting the multiplication tables. And I think, if I'm right, that piece was asking for new equations every time, so that actually it would be hard every time. And it seems like with Ford's piece, with the transient flows, there's no way for him to be like a master of this, even though he already is like a masterful clarinetist. I'm curious, like, about if you could just talk a little bit about that part of your practice as a composer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. So I don't want to go too big, but I will say that with these, there's this, a lot of the instrument, like specifically like instrument building projects I've done in the last number of years, have involved this idea of kind of networked systems. And I mean that abstractly, not like, electronic thing, but network systems where you're working with various other points in a network, whether they're other people or other objects or forces with some kind of agency. And I've started calling these collaborative instruments because, and in this case, even though there's only one human performer, you're dealing with the system with a system of valves and the pump and all these other things that do kind of act independently, and which is different, I think, from kind of traditional instruments in which that have all sorts of complex components, but they kind of become invisible because we usually with instruments, after years of training, an instrument kind of becomes invisible as it gets embodied, incorporated into the performer's kind of larger abstract body, you know. And it's like, as a clarinetist, as a violist, as a hornist, like we spend all the time, and the instrument kind of becomes just an extension of ourselves. In this case, I think that the hydro-clarinet and other instruments like this that I've worked with really resist that kind of process because of some level of, you know, complexity or intentional kind of design which resists that kind of the control of the individual. So, and I think this idea goes back to a lot of other pieces I've worked with where it's kind of just using compositional systems to get that, but in this case, it's the instrument itself. And so I think, like for instance, the composition in this, which as Ford mentioned, is a really kind of bare bones text score, but the composition of it really comes in the construction of the instrument itself, which demands a certain kind of responsiveness and behavior. And so there's all sorts of things Ford can't do, or there are things that Ford might want to do, which he can only do at a certain time or in a certain kind of condition, or things like that. Like Ford's, the role of the performer is still important. Like they still have all sorts of intentionality and, you know, kind of creative input into it, but they are also at the mercy of the instrument and kind of the larger system. And so it's this constant responsiveness and also responsibility for the system, because in this case, you can flood the room if you're not acting and responsibly. Yeah,
that happened.
Believe me.
You flooded this recording venue you just did, or the previous one?
No, just when we were kind of prototyping and just figuring it out and doing some practice. That, you know, nothing major, but we had to learn the behaviors that the instrument demanded. And so I think that in terms of a larger thread, that I'm interested in is putting performers generally into a position where they are really being put on the spot, responding to some kind of larger condition, whether it's the physical conditions of the system or some other kind of you know, compositional system or something else, where they are having to deal with that in real time. They can't, it's not about kind of their individual expressive, intentional expressiveness. It's all about this kind of, you know, kind of hybrid expressiveness through the conditions of whatever world they're a part of. And in this case with, you know, Ford, the will of Ford's kind of creativity is being fused with the instrument itself, in part my design, but also just its own behavior as it goes on. And, you know, and that parses out in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, because I think it takes a tremendous amount of like vulnerability or willingness to be vulnerable as a performer to agree to be a part of a project like this, because it's a system that, you know, is, I don't want to say it's going to fail, but I'm saying that it will be unpredictable and you'll have to adapt. But it's not like improvisation, if I'm hearing you correctly, because you're within improvisation. If you were improvising on a clarinet, you would at least understand the vocabulary of the clarinet. But this seems like, yeah, I'm just curious, Ford, if you could talk a little bit about like the kind of different mindset. I'm thinking about really virtuosic clarinet pieces, like maybe like the Barrio Sequenza or something, versus, and that is scary for different reasons. But I'm curious about a piece like John's, where you're really putting yourself on the spot and you're kind of being willing to sound, I don't want to say bad, but to sound in like different than what you're used to.
Well, one thing that I always do in my group Unheard of is tackle these different projects and different extended techniques with the mindset that, okay, how do we get the sound we want? Not okay, am I producing a good or a bad clarinet sound? Is it like, okay, is this the right sound? And there are all of these different languages within contemporary composition that can be used on the like B flat clarinet itself. What's any different with this? It's just finding a technique, finding an extended technique. I mean, in something like Grisé, putting a like bassoon reed into a trombone is considered a novelty only because of the novelty of the sound and the idea that there's like a tradition behind it. Well, who cares about tradition? I mean, it's just finding the sound that's correct, or sound that you're wanting to express, and then putting it out there, in my mind. And when John sort of like created these like expressive boxes, like, okay, this is the section where we are going to be exploring the reed tones. This is the valve tone section. This is where we're going to play with the upper valve joints. There are all of these little like sections upon which I can play. In a way, I'd actually say that there is sort of like a built-in like language around it. It's just a little bit different than you'd be expecting. There's still these parameters that I can't go beyond. It's like I can't necessarily like reverse the flow of the water. The pump only goes one way, and I can back up to the pump by causing the water level to rise, adding more or less water to the instrument itself, or backing it up. I can adjust the bottom valve completely and just let the instrument flood the entire room if I really wanted to. But within that, I'm still limited by this realm of like real physics and the reality of the situation I'm in, which in a way is sort of the limiting factor of any instrument,
very
right?
real sense. We live in a physical world, so of course we have to abide by those rules.
Other than that, it's like all sounds are equal.
Well, as you're talking a little bit more, I mean, about, because we keep talking about this pump and things like that, I know we just opened the conversation with that, but could you just explain a little more, either of you, like, if I were to go to the hardware store with a list, what would I purchase in order to make a hydro-clarinet?
Well, yeah, you start with like an electric water pump, and it's just the same type that you I think used for most like fish aquariums or that type of thing, which is just an electric pump, which doesn't have much speed control by itself. But when you split the flow, which we used, I used vinyl tubing, and then you can kind of split the flow and then use the changes in pressure between like going one way or the other way to control the flow that way. So you can the basic control Ford has for how much water to send into the pump is by how much he opens or closes a valve, which returns the water back to the main bucket reservoir. And so from that, it just kind of expands into this larger network of tubes. And so he controls how much goes into this instrument, which is all constructed of PVC parts for the most part, and different types of valves. There are a few types of valves that are used to basically route the airflow when he's blowing into the instrument. So there are different types of paths available when he's just letting the water flow and manipulating these other tubes, versus when he's actually blowing into the instrument, the air kind of flows in a different pattern. There are a few different ways it can go. So once you get into that level of complexity, then you're dealing with different valves and these different hydrodynamic mechanisms. But none of that is essential to the basic mechanism of the instrument, which is just water being pumped through this series of tubes. And then the only other addition to that is that, as Ford mentioned, are the microphones we used, which are part of the instrument itself, because he's controlling their placement. Both, they're kind of in these telescoping tube mechanisms, which he can control how close they are to the internal operation of the instrument, and then opening and closing each valve, which really puts him in a position as a listener, being able to listen to the resonance of the water flowing with different tube lengths. And then when he takes them out and puts them at outside of the instrument in different places to control the sound that you're hearing.
I know that.
So yeah.
Well, no, that's really helpful actually, because I realized, like, when we asked for a video for Music for Your Inbox, of course we want a piece that will be best enjoyed or experienced in a video format. But I know that you did play this piece live as well, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to know, because for it in the video, you're wearing headphones, and I was assuming that you were listening to what those DPAs are doing. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. Basically, you have the left and the right DPAs, or like top and bottom become left and right, and they're panned out. And John has eloquently designed like a sort of, I think it can be even further spatialized. I don't know if you've done sort of like an ambisonic setup for this one yet, John, but I remember you talking about that.
Yeah, well, there's another iteration of this piece which is going to exist in April, which is still being formed as part of a larger water cycle. But so, and Ford and I have done this live twice, where it's in a kind of simple stereo image, where it's the same idea, but it does really lend itself to this kind of a video format, because of the ability to pan that left and right, which still works in live performance, but it's not as dramatic.
So in the live performance, is there a PA
Yeah.
playing back left and right?
Yeah.
And it's panned in the same way?
Yeah. So for the performances that we did in New York and out on Long Island, we had a stereo PA, and the instrument was behind it in the space, and essentially the volume of the PA is like drastically over anything you'd hear acoustically. You can still sort of hear a little bit of that acoustic sound within the space, but you're essentially just getting the like PA image. And it is sort of weird to see such a small thing magnified. One problem with it from an audience perspective is that if you're 50 feet away from it, you essentially need binoculars to be able to see some of these like micro valve adjustments. It's nice to be able to have video to like see it up close, and I think that's what makes the video that we're gonna, or that you're gonna be putting out like really special. That said, though, there is a format that we've been talking about, which would also be like quite fascinating, which is to have a gallery installation or some sort of installation where you can have just like, imagine playing, having a space where the sound is sort of exists, and having people come up and be able to actually like touch the valves, be able to be a part of the actual process itself in some way. And, that's something that we have not tried yet, but I really do like the idea of having like people come up and exist in the space of the instrument. It sort of breaks down this barrier to like what it is. It's like anyone can turn a valve, anyone can be a part of this like environment and experience. Yeah. John, do you want to add anything to that?
That's another conversation we need to have, because I'm trying to do that in April. But yeah, I guess the tangibility of the water flow itself is very important, and I think it does really, because of what you can do with a camera frame, it does translate really well in this format, and being able to get up close to the nuanced ways the water is flowing, and in an installation format, which is, as Ford mentioned, is something we're trying to do, that will feel very different, obviously.
Well, because it sounds like, you've designed and built this instrument, and now you have a performer who can play it. So you've gotten beyond just the, will this work? How does it work? And now you're actually making art with it, which is where the composition element comes in and the interpretation. So it sounds a bit as though the installation version would be taking a different path. Like at the, what I'm saying, like where the point you got to with the development and build, like the design and build. The thing I really like about this piece that you're releasing with us is that if you close your eyes, it actually still sounds like music. And it's really engaging to have the headphones on. I find I've listened to it and watched it in both formats, and both are rewarding. But the first few times I heard it, I only had my headphones with me, not my AirPods, but like, don't worry, I used real headphones. It was amazing. There was a lot of panning and stuff, but it wasn't distracting and pulling me out of it. It was actually pulling me into the music. That's why I was kind of curious if that's what Ford is listening to, is pretty much what you're sending the people who are watching the video. Is that essentially the same audio image?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the most prominent sources, but we had a number of mics in the room to get up close to certain parts of, because you know, even when I call this an instrument, I kind of use that, you know, air quotes with that, because it's an instrument system with a lot of different parts that are not just operating and influencing it, but sounding. So the sound is emanating from a number of locations. And so it was important for us to kind of get a good mic signal on each one of those points, which all got mixed into the recording. And it's really great to be able to have the control to shape that in this context. And I was just going to kind of add to that, like in terms of the dynamics of the performance and the sound itself, it's as much as I talked about the kind of the system and how much, you know, the degree of agency that's being taken away from the performer, or kind of putting them in this different context. At the same time, Ford really kind of took this piece to another level as a performer that I couldn't do by myself, for instance. You know, and with the first time we actually were in person working on it together was a huge change in the piece, because I had been, you know, in early COVID, I was working on this by myself and doing the limited things I could do with a clarinet mouthpiece. And as soon as it kind of swapped hands and I was sitting back listening, and Ford was kind of just getting in touch with the instrument itself and kind of figuring out the mechanics and making the adjustments, you know, it went into a whole nother place where Ford's kind of sound vocabulary started with some ideas that I worked with, but just kind of like, you know, times 1,000. And where he was able to kind of work with these basic ideas and basic behaviors and find all this kind of nuanced sound territory and, you know, dynamics in between that, which really, I think, comes through in this performance.
Yeah.
That said, though, you know, if someone wants to explore this, it really just requires a basic clarinet embouchure, which I'm happy to give anyone hydro-clarinet lessons. Just, you know, feel free to DM me. But it's like a basic clarinet embouchure, and really the individual is only limited by their imagination of what to do with it in some ways, and the actual system itself. But, you know, you can really experiment and find different sounds. Each time I came back, I was surprised at something new that I discovered that I didn't know existed like a month ago. It's fascinating to sort of uncover that.
Like you're saying, John, calling it a system, you know, kind of that helps me at least with the definition of it and understanding more like what the possibilities are. I think, I mean, I know that you're a horn player, and I'm imagining you in lockdown alone. Could you not have built an instrument with some kind of brass mouthpiece, or is the reed a key element to this?
I think the reed, I mean, I did, when I was working on it, I was using my mouthpiece, and I kind of would go back and forth between using an attachment for my mouthpiece and for the clarinet mouthpiece. In this case, the reed is important. There's there are more gradations, I think, between like the kind of contact you have between, I'm not sure what the right terminology is, but between like kind of a fully sealed embouchure and kind of more open, like he can get more air kind of in between air sounds and pitchy sounds, like particularly when, you know, there's kind of a middle section where we've taken out one of the microphones, the internal microphones, and placed it outside, and one is still inside, which are very sensitive. As soon as you start kind of putting air into the instrument, even with those mics turned all the way down, they still clip very easily. And so in that section, like Ford is able to kind of achieve this really soft, airy tone right on the edge of that, like the maximum potential, like threshold of that microphone that you could not get with a brass mouthpiece, kind of getting that degree of pitch and that kind of soft, airy, pitchy sound.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I'm not sure what spectrum to place that on, but the degree of control in that kind of softer dynamic is really important for the sound world we were playing with.
So, Ford's comment about this not being sort of TSA friendly, does that mean you're like, are you thinking about, because I know that you are somewhat bi-coastal in your art practice, are you thinking about making a second one that would live on the West Coast?
That's an open question right now, which I'm trying to get some more funding to maybe build a newer version of this, which maybe could be like, the instrument would be very, very packable if it did not have to be water sealed, which requires, cementing, because PVC, it's like playing with Legos kind of. But when you seal things so that they're watertight, then it becomes different. So I would like to make a version that is packable. But that's funding dependent, because it actually, that kind of PVC actually starts to get pretty expensive.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, I'm sitting here on the West Coast and I've seen the video and I've heard the recording, and now I would like to see it live. So this is just a very self-serving question.
No, it's a good question. It should be more affordable, but it's a design problem which I need to solve.
Yeah.
If it's outside, though, it doesn't matter if it's fully water sealed. Just throwing that out there.
That's true.
There's a beauty of it leaking,
right?
And
while
you're playing it in public.
How many liters, or sorry, gallons or milligallons or whatever?
I think it's about 2 gallons. I need to figure that out when I get back to New York, because I'm replacing that part of the system, the bucket, the reservoir. And I think the one that we had was about 2 gallons, which is necessary because the pump always has to be submerged.
Oh, okay.
But then, of course, you're always losing water as you're putting more into the instrument. And so it's all about kind of managing minimums and maximums of the amount of water.
Wow.
It's surprisingly not as much as you would think, though. It's only like a hefty, like a garden bucket or something, or like a planter pot.
But I mean, I'm
imagining
like 2 gallons of water on the floor in the room I'm sitting in right now, and that's going to be a hard pass. So like, I can see what your comment about outside being really important. But then, of course, I'm thinking about acoustics outside.
That
said, a lot of these sounds were so subtle. Anyhow, it's
well, it depends on the level of like amplification you would want in the space, I think. But it's really actually pretty safe inside. If you put if you put something underneath the bucket, at least the sealed version is pretty concert venue safe, all things said. 3 venues and only about like a couple teaspoons of water sloshed over.
Call up Carnegie Hall, let them know. Oh, right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah. Anyhow, I know that everyone's got busy schedules right now. I'm just so grateful to you both for talking to me about this, because it's fascinating. And I know we got really technical about the nitty-gritty of how this system works and the construction of it, but it's also just a great video to watch and to listen to, even if you know nothing of any of these things. I think, Ford, you did a great job with the lighting and the camera work. And it's a tremendous thing to have to film and perform the piece. I know from personal experience. So that makes it even more impressive when I see the final product. It was really, I'm excited for the world to see this. So if people do want to see the video, you can buy tickets on our website or through our bio. And the release date is the 20th of this month, which is next Friday. And our ticket deadline is the 15th of the month, which is Sunday. And so if you buy a ticket, you get a postcard mailed to you in the real mail, and this link to this video in your email. So thanks to you both. Thanks to John, and thank you to Ford.
Yeah,
And
thank you. We're really excited to have it. We're really excited to have
Thanks
it
for having us
in this context.
yeah, me too. I'm so happy that this turned into a video, because I think that this piece has legs in all different formats, and I'm happy to be hosting the video aspect. So take care to you both, and have a good afternoon or evening, Ford, and we'll see you on the internet.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yep. Thanks to everyone for coming. Really
Yeah,
appreciate you sticking around to hear us.
Bye.
Bye.